it's absolutely amazing to be able to introduce Mike. Now, Mike is a sleep consultant at the Evelina. For those of you who work in the trust will probably know him well, and he really is an amazing doctor. He's trained all over the world: Glasgow, Nottingham, Sydney, and of course here in London. And in addition to his work as a sleep consultant, he's also one of the founding members of the Rainbow Badge Project, and you can see me wearing mine today. It's a privilege to have him speak today. Mike, I'll hand over to you. Thank you very much for speaking.
Thank you very much for having me. So the last time I was here, I was talking about pediatric sleep disorder breathing. So I have to admit, I was slightly surprised when I got the invite to come and talk to ENT surgeons. So thank you for asking me to come. What I'm going to do today, so hopefully in about an hour or so, I'm going to run through a little bit about my personal experience growing up, but actually what I want to try and get across is what it's like if you are an LGBT plus child or young person in the UK today. What is the actual reality of that? And there's a few myths and a few misconceptions about that, and then there's the reality. And then towards the end, what I will start to talk about is the Rainbow NHS badges and how hopefully that can be part of trying to help to continue to make things better. As many of you will know, I shout about things quite a lot, whether it's pediatric sleep or sleep for shift workers or LGBT plus issues, and I do quite a lot of that on Twitter. So if you're interested in any of the things that I'm talking about or want to make comments or questions, Twitter is often quite a good place to find me. I grew up in the Highlands of Scotland in the 80s and 90s. And in the 80s and 90s, in the UK in general, in the Highlands in particular, it was not really a very positive and welcoming attitude if you were LGBT plus in any way, shape or form. And that was very much reflected. If you look back at the newspaper headlines of that time, these types of stories were commonplace. This was just the prevailing attitude towards, predominantly at the time, gay men were the focus of this in terms of the media. But so things like, I'd shoot my son if he had AIDS, says Vicar, Britain threatened by gay virus plague, gays in fear, my doom gay plague. A lot of the HIV AIDS fear drove a lot of this. But there was a very negative attitude towards gay men and LGBT plus people in general in the UK in the 80s and 90s. Every single time I present this statistic, I have to mentally check it myself to convince myself it's actually true. The UK does a social attitude survey every year that asks questions about things like attitude towards homosexual activity, homosexual people. And in 1987, they asked a standard question, which is homosexual activity is always or mostly wrong, and asked what proportion of people agreed with that statement. In 1987, 75% of the UK population agreed with that statement, and that was just seen as normal. If you did not believe homosexual activity, as defined in the statement, was always or mostly wrong, you were very much in the minority. So this was a time not that very long ago, I was 10, 11, around about this time, where this was just how people perceived people like me, effectively. The Prime Minister at that time was Margaret Thatcher, and in 1987, this was just after I turned 11, Margaret Thatcher at the Tory party conference stood up and said this, that children need to be taught to respect traditional moral values, by which she meant cis hetero lifestyles, not gay men and other differences, and that if you are being taught that you have a right to be gay, that these children are being cheated of a sound start in life. And she very much made this one of the planks of her conference speech that year, of saying that the attitude towards people who were trying to say, well, actually, maybe we should be talking to children, young people, to try to change these attitudes in a positive way. She was saying, no, I'm having none of that. This is wrong. These children are being cheated out of what should be the right thing for them. At this point, by the way, I'd literally just turned 11, and I was one of those annoying 11-year-olds who was watching the news and reading the newspapers and all the rest of it. So I was seeing all of this at a time when I was just beginning to realize that actually I thought that might be me. There was something different about me that I was beginning to be able to think about in terms of thinking, actually, I like boys and not girls, to be able to start to think of myself as gay, but at a time when the attitude towards that was very, very negative. Thatcher's speech led in very short order to a piece of legislation called Section 28. Section 28, which applied across the UK, was a piece of legislation that said that local authorities and effectively schools were not allowed to intentionally promote homosexuality or publish material with that intent, or to promote the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. She's just given a beautiful example of a modern family. In 1987, that would have been described as a pretended family relationship. It's not real, according to Thatcher and all the people who were writing policy at that time. Section 28 was a phenomenally toxic and corrosive piece of legislation. And for kids like me growing up in the shadow of it, what that meant is that nobody could ever speak about gay or LGBT plus issues in broader terms in any positive way. There was no positive reinforcement, no positive role modeling, and it was actively not permitted in schools. Section 28 persisted on the statute books for quite a long time, and as late as 2001, so which is 20 years ago now, but it still feels like yesterday, 2001, Theresa May, who was then the Shadow Secretary for Education and Employment, in the debates about whether Section 28 should be repealed or not, was making the argument that parents want the comfort of knowing Section 28 is there, that she was arguing that parents wanted their children to be protected from this idea of pushing and promoting a homosexual agenda, an LGBT plus agenda. Those attitudes towards gay people were reflected in the media and in TV. So in the middle of the 80s, EastEnders had not been on the air that long, but was already very popular. And a few years into its storyline, one of its characters, played by Michael Cashman, who was later one of the founders of Stonewall, now sits in the House of Lords, was a gay man in EastEnders, had a relationship, and in one episode, he dared to kiss his lover on the lips. And this was it. This was as graphic as that scene got. It was a kiss on the lips, no more than that. And it sparked a huge outroar. This called for EastEnders to be scrapped, that if things like this were being shown, then EastEnders should be after the watershed. Tory MPs saying that this is absolutely disgraceful that this revolting scene went out at 7:30 p.m. Two men kissing on the lips, that's all that it was. But this was the response in the media and in the public in general, that this was seen as edgy, controversial, and wrong in many people's eyes. The eagle-eyed amongst you, by the way, this is a story from The Sun. This was written by Piers Morgan at the time, so somebody who hasn't quite gone away yet either. When you take all of those things together, and if you were somebody like me, so I was 10, 11 years old at the time, I was watching EastEnders, I was seeing all this, feeling very nervous about watching things like this on the TV. I was reading the papers, I was hearing those news stories. If you are the kid growing up realizing that what these people are talking about is what you think you are beginning to understand that this might mean you, what that makes you feel is very scared, very isolated, and very alone. It makes you feel too scared to ever be able to talk about those things and say, I think I might be, because you fear immediately the consequences of doing that. And we know that when that happens, when children, young people, when adults have feelings like that and cannot verbalize and express them, they tend to turn that in on themselves, and it becomes a very negative, kind of toxic way to think and feel. And that can have a huge amount of consequences. And we'll touch on some of that as we go through. However, what you all also know is that the 80s, although it feels very, very recent to me still, was quite a long time ago now, and it did get better. And the prevailing message often when we think about attitudes to LGBT plus people in culture, in media, in politics, is this idea that things got better. And they absolutely did, and they have done. We saw Section 28 being repealed. It was repealed in Scotland before it was in England and Wales, because we're a little bit more civilized in Scotland eventually. We saw civil partnerships coming in. We saw equal marriage coming in. We saw changes in legislation, first to get rid of the negatives, and then to bring in actively positive legislation to support LGBT plus people just to live their ordinary lives. We saw that reflected in the media. So where Michael Cashman's character in EastEnders, him being gay was often the sole focus of his storylines, and that's what it was all about. Over the course of the latter part of the 90s and into the 2000s, what we started to see was a much better representation of LGBT plus people on our screens, where being LGBT plus wasn't necessarily the only reason for them to be in the storyline. So I love, for example, Tara and Willow from Buffy, whose relationship just grows organically as part of the storyline rather than being the entire focus of that storyline. So we begin to see that change, not just in politics and legislation, but also reflected in media and entertainment in that side. that kind of came to a very key step forward in many ways a few years back with this film called Love, Simon. And Love, Simon is a very, very straightforward, by the numbers Hollywood romantic comedy. Boy fancies person, there's a bit of misunderstandings, he falls out with his friends, there's issues with his family, everything all gets wrapped up neatly at the end, and there's a happy ending. So it's a very conventional romantic comedy in many ways. But what made it different was that the lead character is Simon, and the person he fell in love with was another boy. So it was the first kind of time on the big screen, in a mainstream film, that this kind of idea of an LGBT plus relationship was being presented as just part of the normal in terms of romantic comedy. So it felt at the time like a big step forward. It was people like us, people like me, being able to see stories about people like me in a natural way on the big screen, which historically was not something there's been an awful lot of. The title of this talk is You Get to Exhale Now, with a question mark on the end. And the reason for that comes from this film, Love, Simon. There's a key scene in the film where Simon, having been outed a little bit ahead of where he would have liked to have been, has a conversation with his mum about the fact that he's gay. And he talks about being able to open up, to unload, to let himself tell his mum who he is and what's going on. And his mum, who is a lovely, supportive, middle-class American woman, basically says, of course, nothing's changed. We love you. You get to exhale now. You get to get rid of all of this thing you've been holding inside. You get to breathe out. You get to be you. And it's a lovely scene in the film. It's very positive. It's very supportive. But this is where there's a little bit of an issue with films like this. It's also very easy. Simon's story, when he gets to that coming out, is actually fairly straightforward, apart from the normal ups and downs of narrative for these films. His family are immediately supportive. They're there with him. His friends, once they get over the other bits and pieces that have nothing to do with him being gay, particularly are very supportive. So he gets quite an easy ride of it. But this kind of idea of you get to exhale now, everything is better, is often one that we find when we talk to people who don't have much experience of LGBT plus issues in the UK today. Lots of people will say, oh yeah, but that was a problem, but everything's better now, isn't it? You've got films, you've got laws, you've got equal marriage, everything's a lot better. What are you worried about? So sometimes these kind of ideas can still be part of the problem. The idea that the problems that we saw for me growing up in the 80s are now solved is actually not quite as accurate as we would like it to be. And we can look at that by looking at what the actual lived experience of LGBT plus children and young people in the UK today is. A lot of what I'm going to talk about over the next few slides takes data from something called the Stonewall School Report. And what the school report is, Stonewall have done this a couple of times, the most recent in 2017, is where they go into schools and they ask children, young people, their attitudes towards LGBT plus people. They ask LGBT plus children, young people themselves what their own experience has been. So this is as good a description as we have of the lived experience for many LGBT plus children and young people in the UK today. Before we go on and talk about that, though, one of the things that's often part of the difficulty in this is we often don't know who we're talking about. So obviously, one of the things is that we all choose when we come out and talk about our sexuality, our gender identity, those of us who are LGBT+. And for many children, young people, they may not have reached that stage yet. But we should be able to think about what proportion of the population we would expect this to apply to. And one of the challenges is that we don't actually have brilliant data that tells us something as simple as how many LGBT plus people are there at any one point in time in any one country. The data that we've got historically, so this is data looking at lesbian, gay and bisexual people, this doesn't include trans and non-binary people, suggests that about 2% of the population overall historically has been able to declare themselves as being lesbian, gay or bisexual. When we break that down a little bit by age, though, things start to get a little bit more interesting in terms of who we're talking about. And when you look at the 16 to 24 age range, historically, around about 4% of younger people have said that they identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. One of the things we've started to do is to ask that question in a slightly different way. So the Office for National Statistics does a number of annual and less frequent surveys that include things like asking about sexuality and gender identity. And one of the ways they've asked this question over the last few years is to identify the proportion of people who identify as straight, so who identify with the majority, heterosexual, cisgender, and that would describe them. When you ask the question that way, about 93% of people identify as straight, which immediately tells us that there's about 7% who don't identify just as being straight. And that's already a much more larger figure than the proportion who identify as LGBT in terms of the figures from the previous graphs. Again, when we take that down a little bit younger and we ask 16 to 24-year-olds whether they identify as straight or not, less than 90% of 16 to 24-year-olds identify as straight. And as a pediatrician, as someone who is looking after children and young people day in, day out, what that immediately tells me is that if this is true of 16-year-olds, then 16 isn't a magic figure where this suddenly kicks in. It tells me that when I'm thinking about children and young people coming through my clinic, somewhere around 10% of them probably do not identify as straight. And that's a much bigger figure than the 2%, 4% figures that historically we've looked at in the past. We just had data in the last month from America. So this is from a Gallup poll looking at the proportion of Americans who self-identify as LGBT+. So if you look at the beginning of this, this is data going back to 2012. About 3.5% of the adult American population identified as LGBT+. That's gone up to 5.6% in 2020. That's an increase of about 60%. Now, but in those 8 years, there isn't suddenly a 60% increase in the number of people who are LGBT+. What we think this represents is an increase in the proportion of people who feel comfortable and confident in being able to tell people that they are LGBT+. And that again reflects when we change legislation, when we change attitudes, when we change culture, change media, people feel more able to be themselves and identify. So we think this rise in the proportion of people who identify as LGBT+ is not an absolute rise, but what it tells us is more people feel confident about telling people about their sexuality and gender identity. When you ask the American young adults that question about whether you're straight or not, 16% of 18 to 23-year-olds in the US don't describe themselves as straight. And this is where we now start to be able to, because we're better or beginning to be better about asking questions about gender identity, of the proportion that identifies LGBT+, we think around 10% of the LGBT+ population are trans or non-binary. And I'll come on to that a bit more in a few seconds. Data is really important. We have to be counted for people to be able to think about the specific health needs of LGBT+ people, to support, to be able to have those conversations and think about where resources need to be. And we're about to have the biggest exercise in data collection that this country does. So England, Wales and Northern Ireland in a week or so are doing the 10-year census. Scotland has delayed it till next year. But for the first time, this is really trying to get data on sexuality and gender identity in a way that the census has not done before. If you know people filling in the census, this is a really important thing to make sure people know. Many people, particularly younger people who are filling in the census, where the census is filled in by the head of household, they may not feel comfortable in telling their head of household that they are gay or they are trans. So actually it's important to know that even when your head of household fills in the census, you can still request an individual code and then you can go and do your data privately and separately. So what we hope for the first time this year is the census is going to give us really nuanced data, or more nuanced data, about sexuality and gender identity in the UK, particularly when the Scottish data comes in next year as well. We can look at this in other ways though. So again, so I'm a pediatrician, so my perspective about this is very much focused about children, young people and their health and their needs. And we can kind of look for alarm bells, if you like, warning signals that tell us when things are things that we need to think more about. So when we look at things like calls to Childline in relation to LGBT+ issues over the last 10 years or so, we can see a rise in those. We can see in all of the ways where we try and support young people, we can see young people trying to access more support in relation to LGBT+ issues. So that tells us that more young people are thinking about their sexuality, their gender identity, and are still struggling with that and are looking for help and support. I was in a conversation with one of our school nurses earlier who was saying that they are seeing an increasing number of particularly trans and non-binary kids coming through schools who are looking to them for help and support in that because they often feel they can't go and get help elsewhere. So these kind of things tells us that we still need to be thinking about how we identify young people that need support and then how we target that support to them. Why is that a problem? What are they ringing Childline about? What kind of things do we know when we look at the Stonewall data? Really simple things. When we look at bullying in school, 45% of LGBT+ children and young people in school say that they are bullied for being LGBT+, or for being perceived as being LGBT+. Calling somebody in the classroom gay as an insult is still very pervasive. So the LGBT+ status, whether it's real or perceived, often significantly relates to bullying. That 45% figure relates to LGBT+ children and young people in general. One of the things that we are very clear about is that within that umbrella of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and beyond, the plus kind of includes a whole range of sexuality and gender identities. And when we look in particular at trans and non-binary people, including trans and non-binary children and young people, their experience is often significantly worse. And 2/3 of trans pupils in school report that they are being bullied. Bullying is a really corrosive thing as well. If you are a child or young person, you're experiencing that, again, it emphasizes that sense that you are doing something wrong, that there is something wrong with you, and makes it very difficult for you to feel that you can reach out and get help. If you are being bullied because of your sexuality, then that makes you feel, if you are made to feel there's something wrong with you, you feel shame, you feel guilt, you feel that kind of corrosiveness inside that can really eat away. And often young people will then feel trapped by that. If they can't work out how to deal with that, it can then lead to very scary situations. So I was so ashamed of my sexuality, I thought about taking my life because I didn't know how to feel normal again and accepted. How does somebody who is 19 growing up in this country today still have that idea in their head that if she is a lesbian, that she is not normal? So that tells us there's still a huge amount of work that we need to be doing to try and make sure that kids don't feel like this when they're growing up. When kids feel like this, they can feel very low, and that can lead them to some very dark places. Over 1/5 of lesbian, gay and bisexual school pupils have attempted suicide, so self-harm attempts with at least the intention of killing themselves as being part of that. And again, when we look at the experience of trans children, young people, 45% have had a significant episode of self-harm, have attempted suicide. And this is a huge proportion of these young people's lives, and it has a huge effect on every aspect of their health and well-being. And we're pretty confident that if 1/5 have got to the point where they've attempted suicide, if 45% of trans young people have got to that point, a much higher percentage are going to have been feeling along those lines before they get to that stage. Again, when we listen to the young people themselves, they tell us that they still feel alone, they still feel isolated, they still feel scared and unable to talk about how they're feeling and how that relates to their sense of sexuality and gender identity. And that is a real heart of all of the problems when we're thinking about the experience of LGBT+ children and young people today. There are programs in place to try and address that. Education should always be part of the solution. So where when I was growing up, education was part of the problem, we were actively not allowed to talk about sexuality and gender identity in schools, and teachers could be punished, prosecuted for doing so. Today, education should be the reverse of that. We should be educating all of our children and young people about the differences that we all have, to try and make sure that nobody feels isolated and alone to this degree. So we see campaigns like the Time for Inclusive Education campaign in Scotland, which has now been entrenched in legislation in Scotland, to make sure that all school pupils are getting appropriate teaching about LGBT+ issues as part of their normal education. Scotland is the first country in the world to enshrine that in legislation. Scotland's very progressive. We also yesterday, I'm just going to trumpet this because I think it's brilliant, the Scottish Government yesterday incorporated the United Nations Charter for Children's Rights into legislation in Scotland, which I think is a hugely positive step for children's rights in general, and I hope the rest of the UK follows. But campaigns like this, making sure that we are giving kids the right information right from the very beginning about the diversity of who we all are, is really important. Kids are not born looking at difference and wanting to exclude or bully people because they're different. They learn that as they get older, and we need to be making sure that we're building in good and supportive education to make sure that doesn't happen. In England, there's a very similar campaign called the No Outsiders campaign, which again focuses on making sure that all different, all welcome. It's that idea again, so this is not focused specifically on LGBT plus children, young people, this is on diversity in general. That idea that no matter what our differences are, we have far more in common than we do divides us. The No Outsiders campaign does things like, so the classic kind of comeback against campaigns like this is, how dare you teach 5-year-olds about gay sex? And what they're teaching 5-year-olds is not about gay sex. What they're teaching 5-year-olds is that the baby who's just been born, who has 2 dads, is from a normal family and is just as normal a family as the child who has a mum and a dad, or the child who's just got a mum, the child who's just got a dad, the child who comes from an extended family with lots of stepfathers and stepmums and extended half siblings and all the rest of it. They're all normal families, they're just different. But just teaching that, 2 dads, normal family, meets with outrage still. The No Outsiders campaign was piloted in Birmingham, and you may have seen in the news a few years back now, these protests outside schools in Birmingham that were teaching this, saying that we will not stand this, we don't want this, this is not the kind of thing we want our children to be taught. You can see on the far right hand side there, one of the placards says, say no to promoting homosexuality. This is the language of Section 28. The law may be gone, but these ideas are still there. And one of the really scary things about these protests was they got quite a lot of support in from a lot of areas. So politicians were standing up in Parliament still saying these parents have a right to protest and have their view heard, when what they are asking for is to go back to what we have already said is not a supportive way to teach children, is a corrosive thing that harms LGBT plus children and young people within the education system. That idea that although we've seen progress, but actually a lot of these ideas still persist and given their chance will bubble back to the surface, you can see again when you look at today's headlines. So I showed you the headlines from the 80s earlier. These are a selection of headlines from more recent times. And what you can see is that where in the headlines the focus was often in the 80s on gay men, and the prevailing attitudes in the 80s was that if you were talking about gay men, you were talking about paedophiles. A gay man was presumed to be a paedophile until proven otherwise, if at all. But there was this very pervasive correlation between the idea of a gay man and a paedophile in the 80s that was entrenched. And what we see now is the exact same stories, but the focus has shifted. So where gay men are much more accepted in UK culture and society today compared to the 80s, we now see the focus is very much on trans people. So the headlines are not very different, but the focus is now trans people. Trans people are seen as a threat where gay men were the threat in the 80s. And the headlines are not that much different. The one on the bottom right there from The Sun, the skirt and the drag queen goes swish, swish, swish. This is about drag queens coming in and doing story time in nurseries and schools. Trans classes for kids age 2, how shocking. And you go back to the 80s and it's the exact same story, except it's gay sex lessons for Scots schools. The story is the same. What lies beneath them is the same. And the attitude and the ideas that we need to challenge are still there. Where in the 80s, the focus was gay men, it is very much now more the forefront of this negative attitudes, negative feeling is much more trans people, but it applies across the board to all of us. And where the rights of trans people are threatened, I very strongly feel that the rights of the rest of us will not be far behind. If you're an LGBT plus kid growing up today, yes, things are better, but actually, if you're seeing these stories, you're hearing these things on the news, you're hearing people around you having these conversations about trans people or LGBT plus people in general, you are still going to feel like this. You are still going to feel that it is not safe for you to declare yourself, for you to talk about who you are, how you think, how you feel. And that has all the same negative issues that we've already seen still exist. This is often what underlies it. It's still that toxicity of the prevailing culture and the world around us that can still have a huge impact on the health and well-being of LGBT plus kids and young people. When we ask them, who have you got to talk to? We get quotes like this back. I can't come out at home. I can't talk to anyone at home about it. I've never been told I can talk to anyone about school. I'm afraid if I make one wrong move, I will end up outing myself to everyone. When you haven't had the courage yet, courage is not the right word, it can be a really difficult thing to come out. When you've not been able to come out yet, you can feel that you're constantly threatened. And growing up like this is a horrible way to grow up, where you feel you can't be honest with your friends, you can't be honest with your family, you can't be honest with your teachers. You're constantly second guessing every single thing you say, every single thing you do, in case you accidentally trip up and out yourself. If kids feel they can't talk to teachers because they've never been told to, they carry on internalizing all of this. 60% of LGBT plus pupils in the UK today feel they don't have an adult that they could confide in and talk to about issues relating to sexuality or gender identity. When we start to break that down and look at the concept of intersectionality, so if you come from more than one diverse group, or a group that is traditionally subject to prejudice and negative consequences, then this tends to go up. So when we look at Black, Asian, and kids growing up from ethnic minorities who are also LGBT+, almost 3/4 of them say they don't feel they've got somebody they can talk to. These kids are growing up in homes where they have to hide who they are and they just don't feel able to talk to. So we have to think about all of the things that are affecting our young people's ability to express who they are safely and confidently and try and support that. So I'm a pediatrician, I'm a doctor. I should be part of the solution to this. Part of the, well, actually not part, the most important responsibility, I think, of a pediatrician is to act as an advocate for children and young people. We are here to give voice to them when they themselves either do not have a voice or nobody is there to listen to them. We should be the people who they can come to and talk to, and we are then there to help them. And that should apply across healthcare in general. Trust me, I'm a doctor. We should be people who need us can come to, and we will do what we can to help them. The problem is that when we ask LGBT plus people about their attitude towards doctors, towards nurses, 1 in 7 LGBT plus adults in the UK say that they have chosen not to access healthcare historically because they worry that the healthcare provider will have a negative attitude towards them. And that is based on prior experience and experience of friends, colleagues that they have heard accessing healthcare. 1 in 7 is a huge number. They are actively choosing not to access healthcare because they think they're going to be met with negative attitudes. And often you say that to doctors, to nurses, and they say, oh, well, but that's just wrong. It's not like that. We're much better than that. This is a misperceived attitude. It's a wrong idea. But actually, we have data on this as well. Pardon me. Again, this comes from a Stonewall report looking at the attitude towards LGBT plus people within the NHS. This is us. This is Stonewall looking at our attitudes across the board, both towards LGBT plus patients, but also towards LGBT plus colleagues. The link to that report is there, and I do commend it to you. I think it is an eye-opening report just to be aware of the challenges that we still face. Again, this is a few years old now, this report, but it's not that old, and I'm pretty sure a lot of these attitudes are still around. The kind of single slide summary has data like this, and just to focus on a few of those, 1 in 4 patient-facing staff have heard colleagues making homophobic or biphobic remarks. 26% of lesbian, gay, and bi staff say they've been bullied or discriminated against by colleagues. If you are trans, 20% of us have heard colleagues make negative comments about trans people, so actively transphobic comments. And trans people within the NHS often feel that they are also additionally discriminated against within our system. These figures are terrifying. A fairly relevant one at the moment is if you look at the attitude in London amongst healthcare providers, there is a staggeringly high proportion of healthcare providers in London particularly who feel that LGBT plus status is something which can be cured by conversion therapy, which I'm sure many of you will know, it's back in the news again at the moment, is this fairly toxic idea that if you just approach LGBT plus people in the right way, you can basically brainwash them out of being gay or bi or trans. And again, it's a very toxic and damaging thing. And again, we're trying to get that banned at the moment in this country. The Unhealthy Attitudes report also asked people for quotes. The people that asked for quotes were people working in the NHS. The people who were asked to provide these quotes knew that they were taking part in a survey looking at attitudes of NHS staff to LGBT plus people. This is Donald. Donald is a doctor who probably works not too far away from us. This is how Donald thinks about people like me. The needs of others that are not the norm should not be forced upon others that choose to be what we have up to now considered mainstream normal. As human beings, we are biologically programmed to function in a certain manner, and deviations are not to be considered mainstream society. Donald is a doctor with the supreme confidence to talk quite openly about how he thinks about LGBT plus people. And when he means deviations, he means people like me. And if Donald was my doctor, frankly, I wouldn't want to go anywhere near him. I would not feel that he was somebody who was going to be able to give me the care that I needed. So he feels confident in talking about this. How many more people think like this, but don't feel that they can actively talk about it and do it? So I think this is something we have to be aware of within the NHS. Thankfully, it's come along to the world without having to spend very much time in a neonatal unit. But some children are born into the world and they immediately end up in neonatal intensive care. Geeta is a nurse who works in neonatal intensive care, and we're seeing increasingly diverse families come through paediatric services. So when I do work like this, people often say to me, why do we need to know about this in the neonatal unit? The babies don't know, anything about gender or sexuality or all the rest of it, but they come from families that may do. And we see families coming through neonatal units who have two mums or two dads. You are already, if your baby is in a neonatal intensive care unit, it's already one of the worst experiences of your life. That stress, that pressure. And then imagine you hear the staff talking about your relationship in this way, queer, unnatural, obscene. It's not a healthy attitude in any way, shape or form. And it does not make those parents feel that they are in a positive environment for them or their child. So again, these are real comments from people working in the NHS. When you put all those things together, if you come back to that central question, do you get to exhale now? Our young people are still growing up in a country where attitudes are not perfect. They're a hell of a lot better than they were, but they're still not perfect. Many of them do not feel they've got somebody they can talk to openly, and they still feel like they're holding it all in. So unlike Simon, who got to breathe out and let everything out, many of our LGBT plus young people are still feeling that they have to hold it all in, with all of the negative consequences that has. And the question then becomes, if this is the reality, what can we do about it? And that was where this little thing came in. So this is the Rainbow NHS Badge original version. This was basically me and a group of friends saying, wouldn't it be great if we had a way to really kind of signal that we were good people to talk to, that if somebody just came across us and there was something about our uniforms that said to them, do you know what, I am going to be on your side. If you have something that you want to talk to me about sexuality, about gender identity, I'm a good person to talk to. But more importantly than that, I'm not going to judge you for being who you are. I'm just going to be somebody who is here to listen, to be supportive, to be receptive. You can be confident that I am on your side. I am not one of those people that is harboring all of these horrible negative attitudes. So the idea was very simple. We took the Pride flag, which is a very recognized logo, slammed on the NHS logo. And the idea was if somebody was wearing these badges, it would help identify that. As I said at the beginning, I'm a bit of a Twitter addict. So at the beginning, we had about 300 of these badges made. We sent them all over the place via social media and other places, and we just got people to wear them. And the feedback was so positive so quickly. The response to this was amazing. We get it. This is such a great way of doing it. We want one. How do we get one? A very positive swelling of support to this very simple idea behind it. And what we then did at Evelina London was we took that idea and we spent a bit of time developing it. We wanted it to be a bit more than just the badge. We had to do a little bit of work, rather embarrassing for me. It turns out that when you break the rules and just do something like this, there are quite strict rules about writing the NHS logo. And when it turns out that your chief, not your chief, is that your chairman, so Sir Hugh Taylor, who's the chairman of GSET, in his previous job was the head of the Department of Health and Civil Service, was responsible for writing those rules about how the NHS logo identity could be used, then it's slightly embarrassing. So we had to do a bit of work around about making sure that we were using the logo appropriately, which resulted in the final design that you see to the right there. And behind that, we developed a model, a package that goes along with the badges that said that if somebody signs up to wear these badges, what does that mean? What lies behind it? What can a patient, a family, or a colleague expect of somebody who's wearing one of these badges? The really basic point about them is that wearing a badge is a responsibility. If you are wearing one of these badges, you are putting yourself out there as being somebody who is going to support an LGBT plus person when they need it. And that is a responsibility. That means you have to have some insight of all the things we've just been talking about. You have to have some idea about how you might be able to do things to help. but it's also saying that we are valuing that we are people who are going to listen, we are going to do our best to get support, and that this is somewhere where we do practice inclusion, where we try and make sure that we meet the needs of everybody that comes through our doors. We developed this project at Evelina London, so although it's now gone much wider afield than that, we developed it in the Children's Hospital, and that meant we thought it was really important that that included the voices of children and young people themselves. So we work with the And Us group of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. It's one of the things I love about our college is that we actively seek to include the voice of children and young people in every single thing that we do. And RCPCH and Us is kind of like the conscience, if you like, of our college that gives children and young people the ability to talk to us about what they want, tell us what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, so we can get it right for them. And they're a brilliant organization to work with for doing this. So we did a bit of focus group work with young people through RCPCH and Us. We showed them the badge. And for me, one of the most powerful things we did was we went to a Pride event. We had a few of these badges on display. And we asked people just to look at them and say, what do you think when you see this? This was one of the feedback comments we got, a single word, included. This girl looked at this badge and she said, that's what this makes me feel. It makes me feel included. And if you just stop and think about what her experiences have probably been like up until that point, that she didn't feel that with the NHS, I think that begins to talk to the power of something like this about how much it gets across that message. We've also, within the college, we've started to do a lot more work about making sure that the paediatricians of the future have more training about LGBT+ issues. So a lot of things that we've just been speaking about, but again, making sure that they understand the healthcare needs of LGBT+ children, young people, how they can be supportive, how they can be aware of really simple things, like using the right language to talk about these issues can make a big difference. So we're building that into our curriculum. And again, one of the other things that I really love about my college is that last year, we issued, or the college issued for Pride, a really detailed statement that basically comes down to what this quote says. It says, we are with you. We understand the challenges that LGBT+ children and young people face, and we will stand with you and make sure that we are doing everything we possibly can to make sure that your lived experiences continues to get better. And that's particularly challenging in a world where that looks like some things might be going backwards. If you want more information about that, I can send actually links to these later. These are a couple of articles that just talk about how if you want to be a bit more aware of these issues and how you can actively help, these articles give a really great introduction to the simple things that you can do to help. You can also, if you're interested, there are some great books out there. So I was commenting that young Juno has a name with a great pedigree. And one of the reasons for that is because I knew this slide was coming up. Juno Dawson is a young adult author who's written some fantastic books for LGBT+ children, young people. This book is gay, is a book that would have changed my life if I'd read it as a teenager. It's aimed at young people. It gives them all the information they need to know if they are thinking that they might be LGBT+. It helps them understand that, helps reassure them, gives them the confidence and the language and the skills to talk about that. I genuinely think this book would have changed my life if I'd read it when I was a teenager. She's just written like a follow-up book that talks specifically about the experience of trans young people, and again takes the same approach. What do you all need to know? This is a great book to read as an antidote to all of the Newsnight and J.K. Rowling articles and all the rest of it that's out there. This gives you the perspective from trans people themselves of what it means to be trans. And if you're reading all these stories in the media, I would challenge you to read some of the other side as well. And What's the Tea is a great way to do that. Another great way to do it is another Juno. So Juno Roche wrote this book, Gender Explorers, came out last year. And what this does is gives voice to trans people themselves. These are trans children, trans young people, trans young adults, just telling their own stories. And listening to people's own stories is a crucial part of getting things right. That mattered in the 80s. I needed to see and hear stories of people like me. People today still need to do that. You still need to listen to young people's voices themselves. That is particularly true for trans and non-binary kids who are at the very forefront of what is a very toxic culture war. If you look at the newspaper headlines, the Newsnight and all the rest of it, and also a legal aspect as well at the moment in this country. This is only a minute or so long, but I think this is really powerful. This is Emily, who is a trans girl from Liverpool, just who wants to talk to you for a minute.
Hello, My name is Emily, and I'm 11 years old. I just want you to know that hello? Can anyone hear me? Hello? Why is no one listening to me? Listen, I've got something to say. That's not true. Who are you talking about? If I could, I'd tell you it's hard sometimes to say the stuff I want to say. I just feel angry sometimes when people don't listen. If you would just stop being the expert, I'd tell you all of these things about me. If I had a voice.
Hopefully the audio for that works. I don't know if somebody just wants to tell me if it did or didn't, but I think that's a really important point, and it's one that lies at the heart of that kind of RCPCH and us idea that our college does, is that we should not be talking about children and young people without including them. And the next time you see one of these headline stories about trans kids in particular, make sure that you've taken some time to listen to the voice of those young people themselves, because that is what matters, and that is what should be guiding how we approach these problems. The Rainbow NHS badge then is intended to do part of that. So we have some basic principles with the badge. The badge basically says, I'm a good person to talk to about these issues. I'm someone that you can come to and talk to about anything that you might be worried about. It emphasised that our hospital is an open, inclusive environment, somewhere where we should be putting into practice all of the good practice points of NHS working that we should all be doing anyway. We are here to help signpost to support and resources if you need them. We're a good ear, basically. We should be acting as an advocate for LGBT people of all ages and for their families. And we should also be doing a little bit to break down some of those barriers within the NHS itself. So where we see colleagues making homophobic, biphobic, transphobic comments, we should be challenging that. And the badges themselves, I think, do a little bit towards that by kind of saying we promote this kind of attitude and not those kind of attitudes. The project launched at Evelina London in October of 2018. We've got well over a third of our staff are now signed up to the project, and we've had a hugely positive word of mouth response to that. And coming up, well, now just over now, 2 years ago, we launched it across the whole of GSET, and following that, we launched it across the whole of the NHS. And in the last 2 years, we have given trusts across the NHS all the materials to launch the project for themselves. 159 trusts across England have now done that, which is about 75% of every trust in England. So we've seen this project grow from a tiny beginning through word of mouth, social media, and has snowballed into something that is now being embedded into practice in 75% of trusts across England. We are just at the point of transitioning across to phase 2 of the project, which I'm hugely excited about, partly because that means I get to hand it over to somebody else. Phase 2 of the project has been taken over by NHS England directly. So I haven't got into trouble with NHS England at the outset. They've now taken the project over for me, which is great. And they have commissioned an external group that includes the LGBT Plus Foundation, Stonewall, the LGBT Plus Consortium, Switchboard, and GLAD, the Gay and Lesbian Association of Doctors and Dentists, who are together going to take this to the next step, the next level, and look at how organisations within the NHS can continue to improve on the care that they give to LGBT plus people. Again, this is only a minute.
The Rainbow NHS Badge project started here at Evelina London in 2018 as a way to demonstrate support for LGBT plus children, young people and their families. We're incredibly proud of how the project has grown and the conversations these badges have started.
The second phase is a partnership between LGBT Foundation, Stonewall, LGBT Consortium, Switchboard, and the Gay and Lesbian Association of Doctors and Dentists. We will all be working together to help healthcare providers across England ensure that LGBT people can feel safe and secure using NHS services. We will be working with hospital trusts to ensure their services are fully inclusive and take the NHS Badges projects to the next level so that they can benchmark their services and receive either a bronze, silver or gold award for their work on LGBT inclusion.
We'll be looking at things from your policies, what people see the first time they walk through the front door of a service, through to the knowledge that healthcare providers hold around LGBT health.
We think the project has a lot more potential to help improve outcomes and healthcare experiences for LGBT+ people in the NHS. So we're delighted the next phase of the initiative has been announced.
I am hugely optimistic about what this is going to involve over the next couple of years. I think there's a lot. We've kind of put a foot in the door with the badges, and then so the badges themselves, I'm very fond of them, but they are just a way to achieve a greater goal. And we need to continue to build on that. And that's very much what the next phase of the project is about. If you are a member of GSCT staff and you haven't signed up to the project and you're interested, if you just Google Rainbow Badges and GTI, the page comes up and it tells you all about it and how you can sign up. There are other things you can do as well. So one of the things that's really important to trans and non-binary people in particular who may use different pronouns compared to the gender they were assigned at birth is that we can do really simple things like making our pronouns very visible. So again, if you work for GSCT, there's now an option on the Hello, My Name Is badges. You can ask for one that comes with pronouns on. And for most people, they're just going to go, oh, what's that? But actually, if you're a trans person who sees this, if they see me with my badge saying my pronouns are he and him, it gives them the confidence to say, my pronouns are, I am, to be able to, that confidence that you're a good person to come out to about that. So little things like that can make a difference. The world is better, and it's so much better than when I was growing up, but we still see, so Philip Schofield came out last year, and almost as soon as he came out, the Daily Mirror was characterizing his coming out statement as bizarre. They had to retract that very quickly. We have a Prime Minister who will happily put on a rainbow NHS badge, much to my chagrin, when he thinks it will suit him for a photo opportunity. But he will still not apologise for comments that he's made about people like me in the past. All he has to do is say, do you know what, it was 20 years ago, it was the right thing to say. Well, it wasn't the right thing to say then, but it was an acceptable thing to say then. It's not acceptable now. I'm sorry I said it. Will he do that? No, he will not. And that, I think, is a problem. So the people who pay lip service to the idea of supporting LGBT+ people, but won't even take responsibility for their own misguided and wrong comments. That's also particularly important. As I kind of said earlier, we are trying once again to get conversion therapy banned. The Conservative government have been saying they will ban conversion therapy for many, many years now, and there's still no further forward. So Boris Johnson is someone who's quite happy to try and woo the LGBT+ vote and talks the talk, but actually he doesn't really back it up in a way that's meaningful. And you may have seen last week, several members of the government's LGBT+ advisory board resigned because they do not feel confident in the government, and in particular in the equalities ministerial team, that they are actually delivering for LGBT+ people. Last video, if you work at Evelina London, one of the advantages is that we can usually co-opt Dr. Ranjan to help support us. So the last video and the last slide is Dr. Ranj just talking about the Rainbow NHS Badge project and why we think it's important.
Many people don't know, but young LGBT+ people face great challenges every single day, and that includes healthcare. But that's got to change, and that's why I'm so proud to support the Evelina London's Rainbow Badge project, because I believe that no matter who you are, you deserve to feel safe, secure, listened to and understood. So join us, get in touch to find out more information, and let's make the whole NHS a more inclusive place for everyone.
Thank you, Ranj. So that's what the project is all about. There are lots and lots of things that I think the project is about, but for me, what it boils down to is this. When I was a 10-year-old and 11-year-old growing up in the Highlands, I needed to be able to be reassured that the way I was thinking and feeling was normal. There was nothing wrong with me. And I needed somebody to try and make sure that I knew that and that I could express who I was. And my life, I think, would have been very different. I didn't come out until I was really quite old. My life would have been very different, I think, if I'd had that input early on. So for me, the Badge project is very much about trying to be the kind of person that I wished I'd had when I was younger. And all of us, I think, have the potential to be that. And it can be something that to you is really trivial and simple, but actually to that person, it can make a world of difference. We know that there are people who never come up to anyone wearing the badges and say, that's great, or we think that's brilliant, or whatever. But they then give us feedback anonymously and say, do you know what? I just felt more able to be myself because I could see people walking around this hospital wearing things like this. I felt that this was somewhere where I felt included. And I think that's really important. I have so many people to thank, and this is only a small fraction of them, but all of these people were absolutely critical in getting the project to where it is. If you want more information about the project, the external page from Evelina London is there. I say if you're GSTT staff, if you just Google Rainbow Badge on GTI, it will come up. And that is me. So thank you very much for listening to me. I hope you're all still there.
The question is, where can one educate oneself on LGBTQ sensitive terminologies and styles to inquire about children's gender and sexual identities? And what resources are available to educate ourselves as well as patients' parents?
So the places to start, and I can send you the links if people want to circulate them, is those two papers that I referenced. They're both very short papers, and they're both very practical, pragmatic about what you need to know and how you can help. The most important thing to remember, and we really emphasize this when people sign up to the badges, we don't expect every single person wearing the badge to have every single bit of knowledge and have all the answers at their fingertips. All you are doing when you're wearing a badge is saying that somebody who has questions in the context of healthcare that they want to talk about, if they come to you and open up and ask you something, if you don't know the answer, your responsibility is to listen to them, not to dismiss them, and then to help them find somebody who can find the answer. It's not that you have to know all the answers or you have to fix all the problems. It's very much not that. So I think a lot of people are often scared with things like this. So the terminology, and I apologize, I should have stuck a slide up at the beginning to explain the various bits of terminology. The terminology can feel very confusing to people who are not using it all the time. It's, you know, is it LGBT, is it LGBT plus? What's the difference between LGBTQ and LGBTQIA or whatever? And generally, people shouldn't worry too much about getting hung up on things like that. If you say something and it's wrong, if you are talking to a trans person and you use the wrong pronoun, the more you kind of make it an issue, the more of an issue it becomes. I do it all the time with people that I've just met where I'm just learning, thinking about their pronouns. If I say the wrong pronoun, I say, I'm really sorry, I used the wrong pronoun there, won't do it, I'll try not to do it again. And that's it, it's done. If you make a mistake, just apologize for it and move on. The more you kind of try and faff around with it and make it a big deal, then the more of an issue it becomes. Actually, the more the trans person then often feels that it's then about you and not about them, which is really not helpful at all. So stick to the simple things, listen, be supportive, and if you don't know, find somebody else that can do it. I'll send those articles around. The books are a bit longer. The Gender Explorers book is actually, it's a really nice read, I think, as well. It's really nice to hear these stories from the young people themselves. Yeah, they're a good place to start. There's also, if you go onto GTI, there are resources on the webpage that touch on all of the things that I've kind of gone through briefly today.
Wonderful, Mike, thank you so much. I don't know any other questions, just a couple of really lovely comments saying about the power of the badge. Efi said she worked with a young person who was encephalopathic and they called the badge worn by staff was an anchor to know they were around good people. And I think that's really, really wonderful. Another person, Emma, said that she actually had people young people from RCPCH texting photos of the badge posters in different hospitals, which is so amazing, just to show
Hello, Emma.
Of that.
Emma is the RCPCH and us boss, so she is instrumental in all of this. Thank you, Emma.
It's just wonderful to see that and how widely this message has got out there and how fantastic it is. So
I think it's been really interesting to see. So the next phase plans I'm really excited about, and I think it very much is. You know, we've got lots of people excited about this, lots of people who wear the badges. There are just under 500,000 of these badges in circulation now, which, you know, for something that started out as something on Twitter is not bad. But the idea is we then need to get those people to say, right, what can I continue to do? It's not just about wearing a badge. What do I continue to do? And that very much links in as well. So we often get people saying, why are you doing this for LGBT plus people? What about everybody else? Well, actually, the principles are the same. And we should be, you know, it all links in with equality, diversity and inclusion work on a broader stage as well. You know, the stark answer is, why do we have to do this for LGBT plus people? It's because health outcomes are still significantly worse. You know, if you've got a fifth of LGBT plus young people feeling that the only thing that they can do is to try and kill themselves, then we have a problem and we have to do something about that, I think.